You're listening to the Maritime Gardening Podcast brought to you by Vessi Seeds. Well, folks, today I've got Richard Zurawski, and we're going to be talking about climate change. Who is Richard Zurawski? A meteorologist, documentary film producer, TV host, writer, author, university lecturer, public speaker, and media personality. We're going to talk about climate change and how it's affected agriculture over the last few decades, what to expect in the coming decades from a backyard gardener's point of view, and how all of this relates to home gardening. Richard, say hello.
Hi, how are you, Greg? I'm wondering who you're talking about here.
Oh, I remember that must have been in the 90s. It used to have a kids show called Wonder Why. I
Yeah,
remember that. It was a great, I like that idea. I had like one channel. So, I was much too old to
yeah.
watch that, but you just watch whatever. This is back when there was television and TV and a different kind of planet we're talking about. But I remember thinking it was a good show for kids.
We had
And
a
of course,
lot
you
of
were on the
fun.
news.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun to do. We did 65 episodes. It aired
Really?
on CTV. It was syndicated, sold worldwide. I remember traveling to the Emirates to do a Law of the Sea conference. I was one of the keynote speakers there. And a gentleman got in the elevator. He was from Kuwait, and he says, "Hey, you're Richard Zurawski." And I just about fell over.
And keep wondering why. That was your line
Exactly.
at the end. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. So it's everywhere, and the idea of learning for kids was something that I always liked. We
yeah.
also did a math show called The Adventures of the Aftermath Crew, and another one
Oh,
called Wise Weather-Wise, which was on TV Ontario. Both were. So we've had a lot of fun with education, science, that kind of thing. And now with climate change coming up, I'm looking forward to talking with you about how climate change is really affecting how we garden and the produce that we'd be looking at and the health of our gardens and the methods that we have to use to adapt to climate change.
and I guess that segues perfectly into you've written a number of books around this topic. So why don't you just for those that might be interested in a good read, I haven't read them yet. If you want to, we can do an episode about any one of your books. I'd be fine with that. But yeah, tell the audience about your books.
Okay, so I've written a number of books, four of them actually. The first one was the Maritime Book of Climate Change, the Maritime Book of Weather.
Okay.
And that was basically just a compendium of what maritime weather is like, records, historical facts, that kind of thing. And then I did a book on climate change for the Maritimes, which that's about 10 years ago, which outlined how climate change was manifesting itself and would continue to manifest itself in the future. And then I wrote a book about how television makes you stupid, not Wonder Why Notwithstanding. Um, it basically how we, in a video audio format, by relying too much on that, we lose the written word. And so it was about television sort of expropriating science knowledge, that kind of thing. So you don't really get a lot of science out of it.
Yes.
And then the last one was about the science files, which I did for News 95.7
Oh, yes.
many years. And it started with Andrew Crystal and went on with Rick Howe, both of whom are friends and have passed away. So it's kind of nostalgic to think about that. And
The
so we,
science files were actually great. I remember I would listen to that on the radio all the time. And it was I can't remember if there must have been there was a call-in element to that, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
so we basically just answered questions. So people would call in with their science. We discovered that people wanted to talk about science. They didn't want the answers so much. They wanted a discourse. And
Right.
so we encouraged people to call in. It was a call-in talk show. And we did the format once a week, about an hour, 2 hours actually, on News 95.7. And then we created the Science Files for the weekend, which was a 3 hour show
Wow.
that I hosted on it. But it was all call in. It was about, sort of what strikes your fancy. And if, what people don't realize that it's not about the answer. What it is about the question where you say, gee, that's kind of strange. And I've always wondered about that. And that's the beginning of science.
Yeah, it's people often use the word science says this and science says that, and they're using the wrong language because it's, using the scientific method, we've derived the following possible answers to that question. Like that's, it's a methodology for answering questions for actually, you know, framing theories, testable theories, hypotheses, right, and measuring things and trying to answer questions.
Yeah.
We tend to use the word science like it's person. Science doesn't say anything. It's a method for answering things. We use the scientific method to answer a question or some sort of inquiry we have about phenomena.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's
Well, you've hit it on the head, Greg. It's really a method of inquiry. It's the most powerful method that we've ever stumbled upon, and it's only
yes,
about 500 years old. It started in the Italian Renaissance, and it's led to everything: the headphones you're wearing, the microphones, the cell phones, the computers that we use to talk with each other. All
yeah,
of that
I
comes
know.
from the basis in science. And of course, when we talk about agriculture, growing seasons, climate change, the climate crisis, all of that stuff, it's that wonderful, powerful method of scientific inquiry that we're talking about. It's not about the answers. It's about asking questions and figuring out possible routes of answers and verifying it through testing.
That's right, and being okay with finding out that an answer we had that we thought was right later on was wrong,
Hmm.
and just playing with, playing with the problem and being
Yeah,
very willing to admit that we're wrong about something and that sort of thing. Anyway, we could nerd out about this forever. But I
exactly.
agree. I completely agree. So I guess my first question I had for you, and if people, I'll give it up to my viewers. I kind of would like to do a recurring thing with you from time to time where viewers ask, and my listeners, some people just listen to this in their car when they're driving to work, where they ask questions. Because I don't have the science background that you have. People are always asking me questions that I want to give a scientific answer to, but I either don't have the confidence or I don't feel it's my place to speak as. I think that one of the traps of being a YouTuber is people trust you and they come to you with questions. And when people start doing that, you start feeling like you are the person with the answers. Um, and there's way too many YouTubers out there that act like they've got answers that they have no, background in. There's people that have spent, I'll answer a question using chemistry, but I stopped taking chemistry in grade 12. I don't have a BSc in chemistry or a master's in chemistry. I don't know. There's a recurring guest I have at least once a year, Robert Pavlis. He was a biochemist. Um, so, I mean, he knows way, 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 way more than me, right? And he's very interesting to talk to because you can ask him a really simple question, and he'll like give you this great scientifically based answer with all this knowledge behind it because he had to take all of these courses, right? So yeah, I really enjoy that. Um, so the first question I've got here is we've got one term that we use today, climate change. But I remember there used to be a term called global warming.
Yeah.
So why did we start calling it why did we start calling it global warming, then switch to climate change? Do you think this was a good idea? Um, because I mean, the reason I ask this question is change doesn't sound so bad, right? Like I changed my shirt this morning. That's different than the shirt is disintegrating off of your body, right? Because I wouldn't leave work if it was disintegrating, right? So change doesn't have the same overtone as something like warming. Even warming doesn't sound too bad compared to like global livable space on the planet reducing or something like that. That's more terrifying, right? So yeah, could you talk about that? And if you weren't sure, if you could call it whatever you wanted, like you say, head
Yeah.
of marketing for the World Health Organization, what would you call it, or if you're happy with their climate change?
Okay, so let's switch back to the discourse, and really my PhD work was in discourse analysis,
Right.
and so we're looking at the power of words. And so when we talked about how the Earth's climate is changing, we talk about things like global warming. And so immediately the word global means it's all over the world. You think of pandemic, it covers everything. And usually when you start talking about global things, it's not a good thing. Um, And then when you talk about global warming, it means that everything is heating up all over the place. So some of the Republicans back in the 80s started to say, oh, we're not going to call this global warming. We're going to call it climate change. And as you said, change is often very good. You know, you change your shirt, you change your mind, you change the way you do things. And then when you look at the paleo history of the Earth, well, it's always been changing. So you could always say, well, it's kind of a natural process. It was a lot warmer during the Mesozoic, and it was colder during the ice ages and colder during snowball Earth. So climate change became the word that was used by government agencies and various right-wing groups to take some of the power out of the words of global warming. And
You're saying it was politically motivated.
it is politically motivated. So
All right.
there was a big push on to change that. And in order to take back the field, to make people understand how critical the climate is and how we're manifesting a change on the climate, we're now starting to call it the climate crisis. And we start looking at other paleontological climate crises that the Earth has gone through and take a look at the various gases that were outgassed from various sources. And we find that we're on par right now to be about 10 times worse than any other climate crisis that the Earth has experienced, because it's in such a short period of time. So if I had druthers, it would be always referred to it as the climate crisis, where we talk about climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And those are two really important things. Like, you've got to adapt to it, and you have to also, if it's a crisis, you have to mitigate it. So the words you use are incredibly important. Good question.
All right, great. Okay, so that makes sense to me. Is there some, I mean, is it possible? I remember reading something about how you can have polar ice cap melt, which is melting because it's warmer, but because that melt is cooling water, because it's cold water, that it actually has a cooling effect in the short term. Like, I thought it was, trying to give it the best benefit of the doubt. They use the term climate change to account for places where it actually unseasonably cold sort of thing, because of, colder water from ice cap melt, which, like, once they're all melted, that's not gonna, once they're all melted, there's not gonna be any cooling effect. It's just gonna be, some continual warming until there's some equilibrium. But yeah, is that a thing?
Yes, it is a thing.
Okay.
So we have what's called AMOC, the Atlantic Meridian Ocean Currents.
Okay.
And these currents actually transport most of the heat from the equatorial regions to the polar regions. Probably 5 or 6 times more energy is associated in the oceans and transporting that heat northward and southward from the equator than all the atmospheric processes.
Really?
And so our little part of AMOC is called the Gulf Stream. And if you look at Atlantic Canada, 25% of our heat budget comes from the Gulf Stream. It actually, it's an enormous amount of energy. The other 25%, 75% comes from the sun. So that 25% moderates our climate, makes it warmer than it would be. Otherwise, if you're in the middle of the continent, you wouldn't be experiencing that. So what's happening is we have this giant ice sheet, the second largest in the world, in Greenland. And with the climate crisis, Greenland is now melting at an unprecedented rate. And for the Gulf Stream to give heat to us, the ocean water has to be in contact with the atmosphere. It's got to be at the surface. And what's happening is Greenland is melting. That cold water is less dense than the saline warm water coming up from the equatorial regions of the Caribbean, and it's getting capped. So it can't transmit that heat into the maritime regions and to Western Europe. So Scotland, England, the Scandinavian countries will get colder climates until that capping stops. And it looks like this is going to continue for quite a while. Estimates are anywhere from 100 to 500 years before all the ice is melted at the current rates in
Right.
Greenland. And so we could experience a mini ice age in this part of the Atlantic, on the North American coast and on the European coast, because this cold water coming, and there's about 1 million cubic miles of ice that's melting in Greenland. 1 million
Wow.
cubic miles. That would cover the oceans with 20 feet of water if it all melted. And as
Right.
long as that's capping the warm water, we don't get the benefit of that heat. So our heat budget falls by 25%. So it'll be 25% less energy that comes to northern North America and Europe.
By capping, you mean the cold water is on top and the
Yep.
warm saline water from the south is underneath,
Yep.
right? There must be some sort of heat exchange between the two of them, but it's not happening at a rate that's great enough to affect to to affect the capping effect.
Well, water is not a great conductor of heat. So if you place warm water up against cold water, it doesn't conduct very well at all. And it
Hmm.
takes a lot of energy to change that. So if you've got, let's say 20 or 30 meters of cold water on top, you might get some turbulence, some eddies, you might get some warming up in some places where the warm water can punch through, but generally speaking, it's a convective process. It's not a conductive process. It's not like sticking an iron in a fire and then you touch the iron and burn yourself, even though the iron, the end that you're touching is not in the fire. It's conducting the heat. What's going on in the ocean with the atmosphere and the water is a convective process. That's why we have water radiators, where we heat the water and we move it through pipes and put it in radiators that are in the room, which
Yes.
then radiate the heat into the room. But we actually move the water physically. And that's the convective process.
It's a very strange. I mean, usually, if you're anyone that's ever gone snorkeling or scuba diving, you're up near the surface, it's nice and warm, and then you
Yeah.
dive down 10 feet to grab something, and all of a sudden it gets really cold, really fast, sort of thing.
Yeah.
I wonder how that will affect the what are they called? Pelagic fish, like the fish that are near the surface. I mean, they're pelagic because they like being there. But if the
Yeah.
surface was, I don't know, like I mean, what kind of a temperature difference are we talking about?
Well,
Uh,
it's quite dramatic. You'd be looking at temperatures of 20 degrees Celsius versus just around the freezing mark, 0. So you're talking about a 20-degree difference in water coming up from the equatorial regions to the polar regions.
and a
And so,
salinity thing. That's like there's certain animals, certain fish need a certain salinity, I would assume.
well, they need salinity, but they also need oxygen.
Yes.
So if you look at a profile of the ocean, let's say 50 million years ago, during the Eocene or Paleocene, after the dinosaurs went,
Yeah.
the ocean temperatures were really, really warm. At the bottom of the ocean, they were still around 10 degrees Celsius. And
Mm.
so there was less oxygen there, because the water's ability to hold oxygen is proportional to its temperature. Cold water holds much more oxygen. And that's why we had the incredible cod resources 400 years ago, because the waters had plankton, they had lots of fish, they had lots of oxygen. And part of the problem with the warming of the earth is that many areas, not only will they be a little more saline because of the equatorial regions, they'll also have more levels of carbonic acid. So you have carbon dioxide increasing in the ocean, and that forms an acid called carbonic acid, and that eats the shells of shellfish. That makes it difficult for ocean life to live.
Mm.
And you wind up with increased temperatures, coral bleaching, less oxygen, different types of creatures living in the ocean. There's just a whole plethora of tipping points that you're looking at with this, the least of which is probably the temperature differential. You're going to have lots of stuff going on there. A lot of it's unexpected too.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine. I can just imagine. Because I mean, what do you were a meteorologist. I don't know a lot about meteorology, but I'm assuming statistics and models are a big part of it. And it's based on you're making future predictions on existing data. So, but it's all based on a kind of assumed stability over time. But if all of the assumptions are just changing, I have to expect it's going to be harder and harder and harder to predict weather. Uh,
Right now we're in a bit of a crisis with weather. Because all the variables that we use for all the different models, and there are literally 1,000 different predictive models, and each one is slightly different using different variables. And we're finding a lot of the variables that we've relied on to be stable and to
yes.
be not only correlated, but cause and effect. When the temperature goes up, that increases the amount of water vapor. The amount of water vapor increases the relative humidity, and those are all connectable. We're starting to find that those connections are breaking down. We're
Mm,
winding up with different variables becoming more dominant. So predicting the weather is becoming more difficult. I used to say that being a meteorologist was really the best of all worlds because it if you were wrong, you just said, well, that's the weather. Be grateful I'm not your doctor.
yes. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so now the efficacy of weather forecasting is much more difficult. And especially when we're dealing with things like hurricanes, severe weather, reliability of forecasts, rainfall amounts versus droughts, that kind of thing. It's really important to be able to get that information out and make sure your information is as accurate as possible. And right now, we're in a bit of a crisis. Things are starting to change, and we're trying to adapt to it.
Well, I mean, segueing from that, let's think big picture stuff. So, I mean, we've touched
Yeah.
on this a little bit, but I mean, just so that we have the context, what's happening to the planet? But also, why does it feel like, from year to year, you don't really notice, that we have these events. I mean, you can talk more, more about this than me. More tropical storms, more hurricanes, and typically you'd have one every so many years, and we're having the frequencies increase and that sort of thing. Um, how do you explain what's happening to the planet to a person who says, well, every spring it gets warmer, and in the summer it gets warmer, and then in the fall it cools down, and then in the winter we get snow, and it's that sort of
Yeah.
thing. And then some years are colder or warmer than others, and that's always been like that. So what's going on at the macro level that is hard to, just using your sense data, but as opposed to being measured? What's going on?
So a big part of the problem is that we're so short-lived. Our
Yes.
lifespans are short. And what we remember or don't remember from anecdotal viewpoints is mutable. It changes. Like everybody talks about, I had to walk 17 miles to school uphill through snowdrifts. The wind was always in my face and I was barefoot, kind of thing. And so faulty memory is there as well. So when we look at the big picture of our perception, first off, it's not very good. People can barely remember what they got up out of their chairs to go to the kitchen for. So we keep records. Unfortunately, the records aren't, with the current technology, are only about 70 years old. Before that, they were very variable and spotty. Today, we have satellites, we have all kinds of um, measuring devices. Literally 30,000 satellites are in the orbit of the Earth right now monitoring it. Well, they didn't exist even 20 years ago. So all of this is very new information.
Mm,
And we're trying to take a big picture view from a snapshot and trying to get as much information as we can out of it. And that's very, very difficult. So um, because we're so short-lived right now, if we live to 1,000 years, we could compare what it was like during the medieval times to what it is like now, assuming that we had records to tell us those things, but we don't live that long. And
Mm,
then we have massive vested interests who want us to keep doing the same thing because, we talked earlier about stability. Well, economic stability is also important. Like everything that we have right now is based on the carbon budget. It's all based on the fact that 150 years ago, we kind of got the idea that extracting this stuff out of the ground would give us virtually limitless energy without any impact. It was cheap to pump out, cheap to refine, and it would power all kinds of things from
world
cars to
changing. Yes.
airplanes. And so now we're at a state where everything that was good a little while ago is now bad. Got to stop doing carbon, got to get a battery car, got to get solar panels, got to get wind power, got to get off this carbon cycle. So we have a very, very short memory. We also long for stability, just like meteorologists do. We long for the stability in the forecast so that when the temperature changes, it changes other things in a way that we're able to attach a stability to.
Hmm.
And when that changes, then we don't know what to do. We start looking at different variables. We start looking at what is really happening. And you get many different pictures as to what the big global picture is, like where are we going? Fortunately, there are some scientific evidence-based places that tell us what happens if it gets too hot or too cold. And the Earth is kind of a Goldilocks right now, or was until we started climate change. Not too hot, not too cold, just right for life. And life has been here for almost 4 billion years in one form or another. And it's been an unbroken chain of habitable planet. There might have been life on Venus, but it lost its oceans. It was too hot. And now it's part of Dante's Inferno, where the temperature is 500 to 600 degrees Celsius. It's got sulfur dioxides and carbon in the atmosphere. Nothing can live there. And then you look at Mars. It wasn't big enough to hold on to its atmosphere. It lost it all and everything froze. And so we're in this position where we want stability. So there's an economic stability, there is a climate stability, and there is an environmental stability. Like it's okay for it to vary, to go up and down and get a little cooler, get a little warmer, but making sure it doesn't happen too quickly,
Right.
which is what we're doing right now.
And back in the 70s, I mean, I seem to recall, it always starts with scientists, right? I remember scientists, I can't remember the guy's name. You'd remember his name. There was a fellow at Dalhousie predicting the collapse of the cod stocks.
Yeah,
And everyone disagreed with the scientists. Now there's no cod.
yeah,
I mean, there's cod, but it's not like it was. I used to go fishing when I was a kid. It's not ground fish in general. I remember catching pollock 3 feet long when I was a kid. Now they're
yeah.
like this, right? And there's cod, but you're not, it's just not the same planet. So I don't recall. I mean, I was born in 1972, but there was some point in time, some scientists are starting to make predictions. Uh, you know, how's the track record for the predictions? Things that were predicted that happen. Do you have anything off the top of your head you could share with us?
Prediction is really a mug's game. It's really, really tough. You use scientific modeling as well as you can, but without computers, you can't do very good modeling. And so back in the 70s, um, when the United States landed on the moon, the computer that was used to do that landing had less computing power than any cell phone on the planet. And so here you are launching a rocket, putting a bunch of guys in the nose cone of this, essentially, which is this giant explosive thing that's
Yes.
exploding at a nice continuous rate to get them to the moon and back,
Yeah.
with computer power that is just dwarfed by what we have now. So the models that came out, the climate models, their error bounds were enormous.
Right.
And so they could go this way or that way, and the degree of uncertainty was quite large. But as
Right.
computers got better, the modeling got better, the ability to correlate it to past occurrences got much better. So today the models are wonderful,
Right.
um, but wonderful in a bad way because they're not predicting anything good. They're
Right.
saying, I'm just reading a paper right now. It's called "The Emperor Has No Clothes Climate Scenario," that we may have breached permanently the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that we said we wouldn't breach back in 2015. And we have a very limited window of reacting to it. But with the help of computers, computer technology, satellites, monitoring, we still have a small window. But we need to do something within the next few years. And by few years, it's probably closer to 2 years as opposed to 5 years.
My goodness, that's
Yeah.
unbelievable.
And as Mae West said, it's a diamond, but goodness had nothing to do with it.
Yes. Um, okay, so from a gardener's point of view, I mean, we all have these different growing zones. There's things they can grow in Florida. You know, they can grow oranges in Florida. You can't grow oranges in Nova Scotia. And there's things that you can grow in Nova Scotia that are hard to grow in Iqaluit, that sort of thing, right? Um,
Yeah.
and this is all a function of growing zones. You know, how hot it gets, how soon, and for how long. Um, do you have any sense of how? I mean, they have changed. I can find old growing zone charts from the 70s and 80s. They're not the same now. If you were zone 6A, now you're zone 6B, that sort of thing. Um, but how much change is expected? Like, will Nova Scotia be like Florida when my son is my age? That sort of thing. You know, how much change is happening, and what's expected?
Okay, so there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, Nova Scotia will never be like Florida.
Okay.
Climatically, agriculturally, we have no topsoil. So all of our topsoil is sitting in the northern United States, and they're not likely to give it back to us anytime soon. So what we have are acidic bogs, a lot of peat bogs. Anything that we grow is going to be in limited soil that's dramatically different acidities, different bases, that kind of thing. The second thing that you're looking at is as it warms up in Nova Scotia, a lot of the plants and animals, the flora and fauna, will find it inhospitable to live here. They will die
Mm,
out. They won't be
mm,
able to adapt. And what happens is nature abhors a vacuum, and we'll wind up with new species coming in that will present additional problems. We're already seeing that with fire ants and
mm,
certain types of wasps and insects. But not only that, we're also looking at certain types of funguses and diseases that are coming up. And we had our little dalliance with the pandemic over the last 4 years. So you get an idea that this is also happening to the ecosystem. So not only that, you're going to have to be adaptive to the changing environmental structure brought in by pests, brought in by changing flora and fauna and funguses as well. And you're going to have to change how you do agriculture in terms of where do you get the soil from? If are you going to be doing hydroponics? Are you going to be using greenhouses? And how do you keep the greenhouses cool enough in the summertime when in the middle of a heat wave
mhm,
that would destroy the traditional plants that you're looking at growing? So there's a lot of variables happening. Also, oxygen rates may go down a bit. Carbon dioxide rates may be a little bit higher. So respiration, transpiration are different.
mm,
And you're also looking at increased humidity levels because as the temperature goes up, its ability to hold more water goes up proportionately. So you have that as well. Again, it's like forecasting the weather. There's going to have to be some studies done and some modeling done as to what is most beneficial for us. Because right now, we're not self-sufficient in Nova Scotia. We can't feed ourselves. We get
mhm,
most of our produce, most of our food um, from the southern areas of the United States. And if that doesn't come If California is in the process of drying out, Florida is in the process of becoming Atlantis as the ocean
Yes.
levels go up. So the biological goods that we're used to are going to be throttled. They're going to change. So we have to look at ways of becoming self-sufficient.
I think Florida might have been one of the first signs that the price of land, the price of property in Florida, where you had people arguing that there was no climate change at all, and it's like, well, why is a little house that might have been worth $150,000 5 years ago now worth $50,000? And I have an aunt and uncle. They bought a house in Florida, and it got destroyed. They got it for
Yep.
next to nothing. They didn't insure because the insurance was so high, or it might have been uninsurable. Um, and then it was just trashed by some flood that happened there. Um, so that's yeah, it's my challenge is for where I'm located here because I'm about 2 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean
Okay.
Near Terrence Bay,
Right.
and we moved here from Wolfville, and I grew up in Lower Sackville, so I grew up kind of inland, and then went away to Ontario for graduate school, very inland, and then moved back to the most Ontario-like place in Nova Scotia, which the Wolfville Valley area. My wife's from
Yeah.
Ontario, so it actually reminds her of home there. Just
Yep.
feels different there. And then we move here, right? All these granite rocks and little spruce trees and stuff like that, and all this wind. And I mean, aside from it's climatically different here. It's colder here, and it's warmer in the winter and colder in the summer.
Yeah.
But the storms and the hurricanes and the intensity are just unbelievable. And keeping a garden, wind is a major factor. I mean, there's you can have a garden in a windy place, but when you have these gusts that can just blow down, I mean, a lot of things grow up. We train things up trellises, right?
Yeah.
I grow beans on a trellis that is 8 feet high. Well, it's about as high as I can reach, 8 feet high by 10 feet long. So it's an 8 foot high by 10 foot high two-dimensional wall of leaves, and I have to put all these braces in, trying, I sort of have to make a triangle just to keep it from blowing over, right? And there's
Yeah.
all kinds. I've had years where growing things like zucchini, and the whole plant gets blown over and broken, and it basically, instead of getting 15 nice zucchini out of a plant, you get two or three, right? Um, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, you know, what can home gardeners expect over the next 10 years, next 10, 20 years? Because I think a lot of people, when we speak in geological time, 150 years from now, 200 years from now, that sort of thing, um, we should care about that because it affects our children, grandchildren, and just people. It affects people we don't know, but we have human empathy for other people.
Yeah.
Um, but also there's a kind of immediate, like I've heard scientists say we're, as human beings, we're kind of built to think about tomorrow and maybe next year, and we really don't think much beyond that sort of thing. Uh,
That's right.
so yeah, I mean, what can we expect? I mean, and I know, and maybe you could speak this a little bit. I mean, I have a YouTube channel and people watch it all over the world, and I don't think many of them understand what it's like living on the Atlantic Ocean. Like people will say, "Oh, we get a lot of rain here in wherever they live," right? And it's like, well, we get a lot of rain here, or we get a lot of wind. We get a lot of wind, that sort of thing. Like I don't think you quite understand what it's like being a peninsula on the North Atlantic. But yeah, given everything you're talking about and the fact that we're in the Gulf Stream and that sort of thing, maybe you could contrast a climate change effect over the next 10, 20 years in a location like this, as opposed to being in a place like Toronto, Ontario. I mean, they've got the Great Lakes next to them, but it's inland, an inland location where they don't have
Yeah.
a Gulf Stream and in just an ocean effect, right? Where the ocean does keep it cooler in the summer, and so no, yeah, the ocean keeps us cooler in the summer, that sort of thing, and they get a lot hotter in the summer,
Yeah. That's
and
right.
we stay warmer in
So
the winter, and they get colder in the winter.
there's a number of things going on. In Nova Scotia, you're no more than 70 kilometers away from the ocean at any given time, any
That's right.
place. Um, so with the increased severity of storms and the frequency, um, it means that the effects of the ocean are pushing further inland.
Mm.
And if you look at the coastline, the rocky coastline that you have in Nova Scotia from the prevailing winds, you don't have a whole lot of plants there. Most of it is pretty sparse, and they have to be plants that are able to stand um, the salt particles that come
Oh, they're
off the
like
ocean.
almost like alpine. I mean, like there's a place I go
Yes.
hiking down here, and I feel like I'm in a Ricola commercial or something, because it's just all these little bushes and think different
Yep.
kinds of berries, and everything's about knee or waist high. Yeah.
And so a lot of that has to do with salinity. And so it puts salt into the soil, what little soil there is. And with the increased number of storms and the severity of the storms, that pushes further inland and reduces the amount of gardening area that we can have. You actually have to shelter that. Then you're talking, as you were saying, you talk about the severity of the storms. Well, if you get a storm once every 20 years, that's not the end of the world. But if you're looking at a storm like that every year, your garden's never going to be able to grab hold. And not only that, the storms that are coming are going to be providing much more rain. Last year's rainfall at the end of July was unprecedented.
Yes.
It was it was almost monsoon-like. You don't get those types of rainfalls outside of the monsoon belts of the earth. A foot of rain in 6 hours is unheard of. And of course, that provides another type of challenge. So what little soil you have will get washed away or leached. And so you have to be able to understand what to do to protect against it. And because of the frequency increasing, if it happens once, it's likely to happen again. So these storms making their way into our lives are going to become more frequent, more severe. And that also means power generation. We're starting to rely on wind power a lot more and solar power. Well, these are structures that have to withstand the type of wind that you have.
Mm.
And it's the same thing as buildings. Greenhouses. We had a couple of winter storms. My wife's greenhouse all got punched out.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, all the windows got punched out. So we had to readapt the
It
greenhouse.
was a glass greenhouse?
No, it wasn't glass. It was plastic inside of an aluminum frame. So the plastic flexes. And
Ah.
so we had to secure the plastic with very strong adhesive tape to keep it from flexing out during windstorms.
Oh.
And these greenhouses were designed for areas that didn't have the type of variation in wind,
Mm-mm.
rainfall, and severity of wind. So those are things you have to consider. And again, I think the salinity of the air is going to be an issue because salty air is going to push much further inland because of these storms.
Well, and also, I mean, a lot of people complained last year, despite having all this wonderful heat. Your garden needs heat, your garden needs sun, lots of heat. Now, notwithstanding the fire, which was another topic, that was
Yeah,
bad. But a lot of people complained about having lousy gardens last year.
yeah,
And my hypothesis, I mean, I had some of my gardens did just great, others didn't. And I had a hypothesis, and it's because nitrogen is soluble. Like nitrogen is not stable in soil. You get a lot of rain, and you've got some function. Like my garden's on a slope, so you
yeah,
know if I get enough rain, the water just takes everything away, sort of thing. So my theory was that in the gardens where I didn't have enough organic matter in the soil, if you got enough organic matter in the soil, the nitrogen levels are being replenished because soil organisms are breaking things down and making new available nitrogen for the plant.
right.
You've got available nitrogen in your soil, and you've got soil that organisms make available by kind of eating it and crapping it out,
Yeah,
sort of thing, right? So our hypothesis was that we had so much rain that it actually reduced appreciably the amount of available nitrogen in the soil. Um, and if you didn't do anything to bring it back up, like use some kind of fertilizer of some
yeah,
kind, which I didn't do, then you're going to have a reduced productivity in your plants because they need nitrogen. So the beds that I had that were heavily mulched with all kinds of stuff, those beds could replenish their nitrogen levels because that mulch is always breaking down, right?
Yeah.
But the beds that I just had like cardboard or something on top of, or nothing, everything grew really poorly in those ones.
Yeah.
Poorer than I'd ever seen before, and that's despite having such good growing conditions, right? Um, so this is the challenge, where especially for organic gardeners who are um, beyond reluctant to use a fertilizer. Like if they were going to use a fertilizer, they'd use an organic fertilizer, like some sort of seaweed stuff or something. They wouldn't just go to a garden center and buy some, 2000, high nitrogen fertilizer, like something you'd use on your lawn. A lot of organic gardeners would not buy fertilizer and put it on their garden because it's just a kind of a principled thing. Um, I'm a bit more pragmatic on that sort of thing, but that's a whole nother topic. I could probably do an entire podcast on the ethics of
Yeah.
that. If I had to, I think I would. It really depends. I mean, some people say you should use blood meal because it's high in nitrogen. It's like, well, if you got a 2,500 square foot garden, that's a lot of blood. Where's all that blood coming from? That sort of thing, right? Whereas you could get like one bag of lawn fertilizer and just throw it down, and it's just a one-time thing. You're not like, anyway, it's another. We get into this conversation, I have to wrap a whole episode around it because I got so many organic gardeners who watch. They need a much further explanation about that.
Yeah. Well, what you're talking about in many ways, we can learn from other jurisdictions. For instance, in the tropics, especially the rainforests, the practice of cutting down and burning the forests is a common practice where the nutrients of the forest are in the forest themselves and not in the soil, because the soil leaches out because there's so much rainfall.
Mm,
And we're starting to experience that with heavier rainfalls, and we've got a much thinner soil base. And so much of the nutrients that you're talking about, whether it's nitrogen or some of the complex um, uh, nutrients that you need to grow other types of crops, are found in the just in the top layer of the soil or
yes.
in the plants themselves. And if you wind up with heavy rainfalls like we had last year,
Yeah.
it was kind of, in many ways, as far as I was concerned, a missed summer, because starting in June right through to September, we didn't get much sunshine. It was a low sunshine, high humidity, cloudy,
Fog,
rainy.
haze. Yeah. That
Yes,
rain. Yeah. Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. And so if that's what you're getting, that's going to be leaching your soils. And so trying to put nutrients back into the soil based on that kind of environmental input is something we're going to have to adapt to. We're going to have to figure out how to keep the nutrients in there, especially in the smaller soils. I mean, you talk about home gardens, and it would require a lot of fertilizer, but at the same time, those are very small compared to, let's say, what goes on in Ontario or in
Yes.
the prairies, where they have lots and lots of years of stored nutrients in the soil
Yes.
because of a beneficial climate. We don't have a beneficial climate for that. There are lots of things working against us. And this leaching is an important thing, because with the heavy rainfall, whatever nutrients you're going to put in there aren't going to stay. They're going to wash out and leach
Yes.
through.
Yeah. That's definitely. Yeah. I'm not sure what to. I mean, I guess having your garden kind of a really flat surface is important. That's you're not going to have as much. I mean, you're still going to have leaching, but it's not the same. It's different than if your garden's on a slope. It's all going
Yeah.
over there and then it coming back this way, sort of thing. And at least if it's like this, it's just going to fill up. Hopefully it doesn't flood, that sort of thing. But if you could, if you were buying a house and you were in your 30s, and not that anyone that's in their 30s can even afford to buy a house now with the price of houses, but um, and you could pick a place to live. I mean, what sort of, and you were a gardener, right?
Mm,
I mean, I was going to, so you're saying I'm going to guess you're going to say I wouldn't go too coastal. But
yeah.
yeah, what would you be looking for?
Well, you'd want a place that you really mitigate the effects of the ocean. The ocean is predominant in its effects on what's going on in Nova Scotia. So the valley area is probably
Inland.
one of the better
Yeah.
areas, and especially sheltered from the northeasterly and easterly storms that we get.
Yeah.
The second thing is to have a good soil base. And of course, the valley area is the leftover from the Appalachians.
That's right.
And because of that, they do have a good soil base. And with the soil base comes a retention of water. They're less vulnerable to things like drought, and they're able to absorb heavier downfalls as opposed to leaching through the soil. So if I was a gardener, heading off to Blomidon might be
Yes.
beneficial. And you can see all the topsoil that's there, that's
Yes.
protected, and it didn't get scraped away by the ice ages the way it has in most other areas of Nova Scotia. And it's also not an acidic soil. You
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
have a balanced pH that is conducive to growing other things, and you have more control of your environment. You are in sheltered areas where you're getting enough sunshine, you're not getting as much fog, and you're probably not getting as many bad and frequent storms. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that would be my kind of guess as to where I would go. Now, I'm sure there's lots of factors that I haven't taken into account
Yeah.
that may mitigate that choice.
Yeah. No, I would agree with all of that. Yeah. Like there's advantages to being by the ocean. It doesn't get as hot in the summer, and it doesn't, I don't know. The fact that it doesn't get as cold in the winter isn't great, because we get rain and ice. It's still
Yeah,
cold. Like I'd rather it be dry and -15 than, -5 and raining. Raining and freezing and raining and freezing, which is what we have here. It's much worse for gardening. You want like the snow to come down to accumulate. You don't want it to snow and then rain and then freeze and then snow and then rain and then freeze. It's just not good for perennial plants. There's things that die here, like the average temperature in the winter in where I live, compared to Wolfville. Let's say in the winter, it's on average 5 degrees warmer in the winter here. Um, that said, there's things that'll survive the winter in Wolfville that will not survive the winter here because they're under a layer of snow.
you're right. The snow is a great insulator.
Yeah.
So it doesn't conduct heat. And if you've got a layer of snow as opposed to ice
Yes.
or rain, then you're not forming a heat deficit on the environment.
Yeah.
And you're vulnerable to uh, power outages. Let's say you have a greenhouse and you want to heat it a bit, or you have some solar panels. Um, with ice, you're looking at an infrastructure breakdown. Ice, the power lines come down, the ability to heat certain areas get mitigated, and so you wind up with heating and cooling can be a real problem for plants and animals. If you have a stable cold to which they can adapt and they're insulated from it, they're
Yes.
more likely to survive than they are a climate that's going up and down. There are days in February where the temperature in Halifax, because of its ocean effects, can go up to 15 degrees.
Yes.
And the next day it'll be -15 degrees.
Yes.
That's not conducive to a healthy environment for living things.
No, and I also imagine being more inland would be better. Like if you wanted to put solar power units on your roof. I noticed my neighborhood here is a relatively new neighborhood. Like this was a forest 20 years ago. There was no houses. There was probably just hunting trails and that sort of stuff, traditional or even older traditional trails sort of thing, right?
Mhm.
So it's very, in a lot of ways, the wilderness out here is fairly pristine. But a lot of the new houses, they're putting solar units on the roof.
Yeah,
And in the summer, there are so many days where we don't have any sun till noon. Like it'll be complete fog here, and then you drive 20 minutes to Bears Lake Park, which is for those that don't want that aren't from here. That's where everybody goes shopping. It's where all the stores are, the Costco and everything. And it'll be sunny and warm, and everybody's, here it'll be cold and damp, and there's no sun, and you drive 15 minutes, you know, and all of a sudden it's just a few kilometers away, 5 kilometers or something like that. It's
right.
it's it's a roundabout route. That's why it takes so long. Or maybe it's a bit longer than that, but it's close, right? Very
Yep.
close. 15-minute drive, and it's not a straight line, put it that way. And it's sunny and it's warm and it's nice. And I mean, I really started noticing it. I've got a pond in my garden, and it's got a little solar unit that circulates the water. The solar unit, there's a pump in the bottom of the pond. It pumps the water up to a little bird pool,
Yep.
and then the water trickles back down into the pond and gets reoxygenated, and the whole thing just happens with solar energy. So when there's not a cloud in the sky, it works great. And if it's foggy, it doesn't work. And
Yep.
if there's any sort of cloud cover, it doesn't work. Or if it works, it goes from pumping, let's say, a liter a minute to a tablespoon a minute, that sort of
Yeah.
thing, right? So you see the difference in the amount of energy, because I mean, that's the solar unit. That rate of flow is measuring the energy captured by the solar unit, right? So it tells you how little electricity people's solar units are going to be capturing on their roofs. It's also telling you how little energy plants are going to be capturing, which plants get their
Yep.
energy from the sun.
Yep.
So it makes a big difference from a growing point of view.
It also changes the temperature of the soil. So
Yes,
if you're not getting sunshine, you're not reaching certain thresholds,
yes,
the corn heating units that you would need to germinate, to have a healthy root system, for
yeah,
the plant to have the resources to be able to create the flowers that lead to the fruit or vegetable that you want. And so all of those things we need more studies, more scientific studies about it to figure out effective, efficacious methods that are also cost efficient.
yes,
I just put solar panels on my house last year, and it's wonderful not
right,
paying Amera in the summertime. Now, in the wintertime, it's a different story. But right now, we have an electric car, so I never pay for gas. And now I'm not paying for electricity because I only charge it during the daytime when it's sunny outside, which is
right,
enough
right,
to
right.
charge the car. So it's nice to step outside of that. But what I've noticed is that looking at the insolation of the sun, if it's a cloudy day, you're just getting a fraction of the energy.
Yeah,
And as you said, the solar panels are like leaves. So you get an idea of how um, the plants are impacted by cloudy, rainy, foggy environs, as opposed to having a nice sunny day when they should be growing. And you're right, last year was terrible. My wife loves to garden,
right.
and our tomato crop was just horrid. It just, I love tomatoes.
Yeah, yeah.
I was just shocked at how bad it was.
And you're fairly inland compared to me. Uh,
Yeah, well, yes, not Terrence Bay, that's for sure. But um, we struggle with the rainfall, we
yeah,
struggle with the cloud and with the storms. We fortunately the greenhouse wasn't damaged for very long. We were able to repair it after the last storm punched out some of the windows during the
mm,
winter time. Um, so our seedlings were able to survive, and hopefully we'll have a good year this year.
that's a good point to end it. Well, I want to ask you one more question. We're over time here,
Okay.
so just make it really quick. But how would you recommend? One way to prepare is to move and get a house that's further that's in a protected zone, but most of us can't do that. So what would you tell home gardeners to do to prepare for the next 10, 20 years in terms of mitigating and adapting to climate change,
Okay,
the climate crisis?
I am in the climate crisis. Yeah.
Yes.
Um, Probably the best thing is looking at pests and figuring out how to mitigate the number of pests that are going to be moving up. We're seeing that with ticks and ants and all that kind of stuff.
I got the
Creature,
fire ants. I got them right
yeah.
here. Yeah.
Oh,
Terrifying.
they're horrid little creatures,
Yeah.
but they have no predators here, so they dominate the ecosystem. Um, I'd be looking at composting a lot. We have worm composts, we have a vegetable compost, and we're creating new soil as much as we can with that.
Right.
And then, picking the best area, most sheltered area, make sure that it's sheltered from the rain. The rain can be in the summertime, can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing. And I'd be checking the pHs of things,
Mm.
of your soil, that kind of important guide to understanding your soil health. And I guess just getting practiced at gardening is probably the most important thing, because so much of gardening has to do with experience and practice.
And adapting, being
And
adaptable.
yes, and then you know what you have to change and what you don't have to change, because the field of questions becomes smaller the more experience you have.
That's a really good point. I remember when we had the COVID lockdown and everybody became a gardener, right?
Yeah,
And I remember thinking, I don't know if I did a podcast about that. I didn't want to bring people down. I think I thought about it. It's like the time to learn to garden was 5 years ago. Like, you're not going to become it. There's a lot of try. I mean, you can know nothing, put some seeds in the ground and have awesome results. That can happen.
sure.
Um, but there's a lot of things that can go wrong when you're gardening, and you have to learn how to deal with all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, just become experienced as a gardener and read a lot, and that'll help you have the tools you need to adapt to whatever changes are thrown at you.
Think of gardening as a musical instrument. You get better the more you practice.
Yes,
And you spend your 10,000 hours
ten
practicing
thousand
gardening,
hours. Yes,
you'll be a virtuoso.
exactly. That's a great place to end it. All right, great, Richard. Well, it's been great having you on here to talk about the climate crisis. I really appreciate your time, and hopefully we can have you on again.
Oh, I'd
Um,
love to. I'd love to.
Great.
This has been so much fun. Thank you, Greg.
Right. Everybody out there, I hope you found this interesting. If you did, please like, share, subscribe, and until next time, get out there, get at it, have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.